Braveheart is a 1995 Mel Gibson movie that chronicles the life of William Wallace and the Scottish War of Independence. It's also a movie often hammered by history nerds for being one of the most inaccurate historical movies ever made, which I guess naturally makes the film itself bad. And while the movie is no masterpiece by any means, and it is indeed very historically inaccurate, I still enjoy this film quite a bit. I've never been one to judge historical films by how factually on point they are. Within reason, that is.
Ohio.
At the end of the day, Braveheart is a fun, decently written, inoffensive action-adventure movie with a medieval coat of paint that Scots love to go full caveman over. Scotland forever! Recently, however, I noticed a comment left on my video on battle scenes where this dude says my opinion on Braveheart's Battle of Stirling being an awesome battle was wrong.
His influence spreads like a cancer.
And that it was apparently one of the worst films to ever come out of Hollywood, which, say psych right now. Now, of course, while everyone is entitled to their opinion, I can't help but feel this consensus on Braveheart being an awful film, and by extension the movie's depiction of Stirling being branded as awful, is based upon this annoying mindset of every historical movie ever made needing to be as accurate as possible. It's not enough for them to consider how films make us feel, or to consider if they amaze or inspire us. Nah, they gotta be faithful to history, and history alone.
And yet, within that same sequence, another inaccuracy pops up. It's when we see soldiers being shot and killed underwater, which is impossible considering how deep they are, and the reason why is because it goes against Newton's first law of motion. An object in motion stays in motion.
Shut up! Shut up! Shut up!
This video isn't going to be a review of Braveheart, but it is going to be an overview of the movie's most well-known battle scene, and what is, in my opinion, one of the finest battle scenes to ever be put in a film. Feel free to agree or disagree in the comments. On the 9th of September 1297, a combined English army led by Hugh de Crossingham and the Earl de Surrey arrived in Stirling. The army roughly consisted of 9,000 men, around 7,000 of which being infantry, and another 2,000 being cavalry. Their goal was to capture and cross the Stirling Bridge, the proclaimed key to Scotland. Camped south of the River Forth, they were faced off against an outnumbered Scottish force of anywhere between 5,000 and 6,000 men, only about 300 being cavalry. Sounds like something out of a medieval Total War fan's dream. But this wasn't a typical battle on a field. Both a long wooden bridge and wide river separated the English and Scottish forces, and it would greatly benefit whoever was defending. And even if hypothetically unopposed, it would take either army hours of time to cross the bridge. The English, however, would turn out to be the attackers. While initially there was some talk of finding alternative ways of crossing the river to outflank the Scots, these talks were quickly dashed. The Earl de Surrey, the noble and overall command of the army at Stirling, opted to immediately cross the bridge. In the early hours of September 11th, the English began their slow trek across the bridge, and when about 2,000 men had crossed, the Scottish army began its own attack on the English. After fending off a charge from English heavy cavalry, they counterattacked the English infantry. After cutting off their access to the bridge, most of the infantry on the Scots side of the river were massacred, with only a handful managing to escape. All the while, Scottish archers began to fire upon the English still on the bridge and across the river. A nearby English supply train in the Powys Marsh was obliterated as well. By the time the battle was over, about 5,000 English soldiers had been killed or captured, and with the remains of the English army fleeing south, it left the garrison of Stirling Castle completely isolated, and the greater Scottish lowlands undefended for the Scottish rebels to claim. I do think it's only fair that I go over some differences in the film when compared to the real-life battle. The biggest difference being that there's no bridge. Instead of the Battle of Stirling Bridge, we got the Battle of Stirling Plains biome. And while I'm not an expert in filmmaking, it's actually very understandable why they did not film around a bridge. Despite what some nerds on the internet might have you believe, it was not out of a blatant disregard or hatred for history, but it was an issue of practicality. For one thing, filming on location would have been very difficult given that Stirling Bridge is still an actual in-use bridge as well as a tourist attraction. But even if they were to build a bridge of their own, Filming a bunch of guys crossing and standing on a bridge would have been a tough thing to shoot, and probably would have been murder on the actors involved. And not to mention, what'd be the point, really? Most of the actual battle occurred on actual solid ground, without the bridge even being involved. Really, all the money used to build and shoot the bridge could be used for would be getting some shots of soldiers marching and getting hit by arrows. From a filmmaker's perspective, that's not a very smart or worthwhile investment. Another often picked apart inaccuracy is how the Scottish are dressed. We see them dressed in plaid and wearing kilts, and there's blue paint marking their faces. And yeah, that's very inaccurate.
This is outrageous. It's unfair.
The plaid and kilts would not be a Scottish fashion staple for another few hundred years, and the blue paint was a battle mark of the ancient Pictish people group who used to inhabit the land that is now Scotland. And it's doubtful that the then very Christian Scottish would have ever wanted to be associated with a symbol of ancient paganism. So, if this is blatantly wrong, what could I possibly say to defend this change? Well, here it is. Can you tell which of these soldiers are Scottish and which are English? I'll give you a few seconds. Well, if you guess the soldiers on the right are English and the ones on the left are Scottish, you'd be halfway right. The ones on the right are in fact English, but the ones on the left are French. This tapestry is not of the Scottish War of Independence, but of the 100 Years' War. Now, to those of you who may have already guessed that correctly because of the banners shown in the illustration, good on you. You and I may know that because we're nerds who love being knowledgeable on useless topics like medieval vexillology. But I somehow doubt that the average moviegoer would be as well versed in that topic as we might be. Truth be told, there was no way to make the Scottish and English stand out from one another without breaking historical accuracy. Despite what Game of Thrones has conditioned us to believe, real-life standardized medieval uniforms and armor sets weren't really a thing.
It's all bullshit!
So, probably not wanting most of the audience to be confused out of their minds, the filmmakers opted for kilts versus armor. If it had been red knights versus blue knights, I'd be saying the same thing. There are a few more inaccuracies that could be mentioned, but these are the big two that I often hear talked about. So now, let's talk about the things that actually make this battle scene so awesome. I suppose we'll get the boring stuff out of the way first. This part should be over quickly. But how many times have you watched a battle in a film and this happens? You can't see shit. Either the shots switch every half a second and you can't absorb any detail at all, or the lighting is so piss poor that you literally cannot see the battle. Either way, your enjoyment will likely go down while watching. If I can't tell what's happening on screen, or at least make a prediction on who will win the battle, why even show the scene at all? A great example of a battle scene that does not just one, but both of these things is the Battle of Winterfell from Game of Thrones. And I hate that I can say that, because I want to love this battle so much. So much of it is practically done, and the costumes, equipment, and structures look amazing. But goddamn, the scene is just put together so awfully. Try to cope all you want, but I know that you know that this battle was a huge letdown. What the hell is even happening? Oh my god. Braveheart, however, is, in my opinion, perfectly shot. Shots don't go on for too long that they drag, but last long enough for you to absorb the actions of those on screen and the general flow and direction of the battle itself. I can tell from the shots of Scots murdering Englishmen that the Scots are managing to pull through. I can tell from the worried look on the English general's face that he's unsure of the battle's outcome. Everything is conveyed just as well as it ought to be. Another thing that a lot of films, at least from the 80s and 90s, got wrong was the gore and the blood. In my opinion, you cannot make a film, any film at all, about war without there being blood everywhere. War is violent, graphic, and always brutal. And it's hard, for me anyway, to take seriously a film about war without showing those things. Take Gettysburg, for example. While it's a film I overall love, the lack of not just gore, but even simple blood effects makes it very hard to immerse myself in the film. It's a film about Gettysburg, right? You know, the single biggest and bloodiest battle to ever be fought in the Western Hemisphere. Pickett's Charge, more like Pickett's Walk in the Park. But in Braveheart, the filmmakers are unapologetically detailed and flaunting with how they portray the horrors of war. Legs are sliced off, heads are decapitated, people are stabbed in the chest and the face, hands get chopped off, men writhe on the ground after being shot with arrows. Braveheart not only uses its special effects to show off its brutality, but to actively aid in portraying its story of the brutality of the Scottish War of Independence, and in general, how bloody and savage medieval warfare truly was. It seems as though all too often with battle scenes in film and television, troops will appear seemingly out of nowhere. Even good battle scenes are occasionally guilty of doing this, and while I don't think it's a make or break sort of thing, showing off the tactics of a battle can add a much greater sense of scale and realism to a scene. And when I say tactics, I don't mean having a war council drone on for a whole scene about strategy and maneuver beforehand. I mean just being made aware of certain units or groups of troops, and maybe having characters spout some lines on what they ought to do during the fighting.
Our men are running from the battlefield! Shameful display!
A very perfect example of this balance of tactical thought and actual fighting would be the Battle of Hoth from Empire Strikes Back, where before the battle, Princess Leia briefs Rogue Squadron about their role in distracting the Imperial walkers while Echo Base's ground staff evacuates in the meantime. And even during the Hoth battle, we have Luke Skywalker give maneuvering orders to other pilots, as well as figure out how to properly deal with the heavily armored AT-ATs. Braveheart, while not as verbally detailed with how it goes about establishing tactical details, is very effective at visually conveying the strategies used by both the Scottish and English armies. And as the battle plays out, we see how the two armies take very different approaches to fighting. The English are overconfident and fight with no clear strategy, viewing the Scots as no more than a group of rabble. The English order a heavy cavalry charge straight into the ranks of the Scots, after only a couple of archer volleys. This is where the contrast between the armies is drawn, as the Scots predicted such a swift and heavy stroke from the English. The Scottish, not having enough cavalry of their own, much less in the same proper class, have opted to retreat their own cavalry and draw the English horsemen into an unforeseen suicide charge, one in which that wipes out the entire attacking force within minutes. In another show of brute force, the English send their infantry in next. There's no semblance of flanking or creating an entrapment for the Scots. There's only a want for dealing a heavy and blunt killing blow. The Scots, with no other alternative than to meet the English, charge in as well. And while this portion of the battle is without a doubt a slogfest, the Scots do seem to have the advantage in one-on-one combat, as they have the morale of soldiers fighting for their homeland, and they seem to be quicker and more agile than the heavily armored English infantry. And as the brawl continues, the English seem to begin to waver, and their cohesion seems to break more and more. And to make matters worse, the Scottish cavalry that seemingly ran from the battle earlier have returned, and have successfully outflanked the English, leaving their archers, which were shown previously, fully exposed and easy to break apart. With now both the infantry and archers being broken and routed, the English leadership follows suit, effectively ending the battle with a decisive Scottish victory. Throughout the whole battle, there were never any instances of large numbers of magical or Deus Ex reinforcements or mind-numbing countless mosh pit-like collisions. Every body of troops we see was established in the beginning of the scene, and each played a unique role. And in the end, the Scottish were able to claim victory because they carefully and skillfully countered the more brash and predictable English generals by playing on the strengths and weaknesses of every unit involved. So that's my brief analysis on Braveheart's take on the Battle of Stirling, and why I think it's a pretty awesome battle scene, despite its inaccuracies. And even if you don't like the film, whether you just don't like the movie or you take issue with how many things it gets wrong, I hope you can walk away with a better appreciation with just this one scene at least. Leave a comment down below on whether you agree or disagree, and feel free to explain your reasoning. Outro over.